Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Noma Cork by Vinventions. Driven by a commitment to innovation, the new plant-based Noma Cork Green Line offers significant improvements in wine closure performance. Thanks to a rigorous oxygen ingress rate, you can decide which cork is best for your wine, whether it's for young and fresh wines or for those with ageing potential.
After a degree in botany and zoology, Prue Henschke might have ended up working with seaweed or baboons, instead of which she chose vines after meeting her future husband Stephen Henschke and following him to Germany to attend the Geisenheim Institute. Listen to us chat about her views on regenerative agriculture and massal selections, what it's like being the custodian of the 160-year-old Hill of Grace vineyard, and her dream of owning some vines in Bandol. Hey Prue, how are you?
Very good.
Really nice to talk to you. I can't wait to learn from you because you're just such in-depth knowledge, basically. Where are you at the moment? You're in Australia, I know, but whereabouts? At the winery?
Yes, we're at the winery and, yes, just sort of easing out of a Sunday looking at ferments. So
you're in the middle of vintage, aren't you? Obviously.
Yes, we're in the middle, just past middle.
And good quality? I mean, everyone said it's a bit cool this year in Australia, isn't it?
Yeah, well, everything up in the Eden Valley area is looking really good. There's a smidgen of botrytis just creeping in because we've just had 10 to 20 mils of rain, which wasn't forecast.
No, but that's unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's come down from, I guess, the Indian Ocean direction with thunderstorm activity up there, and it's very, very late for that to happen. And
we're going to talk later about this crazy climate that we're living through and how you're dealing with it. But I want to start by just getting into a little bit about your background because you're one of the world's leading viticulturists. So I'm pretty sure it wasn't your original plan, was it? I mean, was wine part of your life when you were growing up?
Well, it was in a way. My dad was very interested in wine, and he would search all over Adelaide for Hill of Grace.
Really? Little did he know.
Little did he know.
So he was a Hill of Grace drinker before you met Stephen, right?
Exactly. There's always, in the fridge, there were 2 milk bottles and a Hill of Grace bottle.
I love that. That's very good. But, I mean, did you think, hey, I might end up going into wine yourself or not?
No, there was absolutely no direction to take me in that way. I was really perhaps more interested in the natural side of life. I'd read a lot of Gerald Durrell's books.
Oh, yeah.
And they inspired me. And then I read, I think one of my most favourite books was The Life of Marie Curie. And I was going to be a scientist, a research scientist, sailing off in my car to save everybody. It was much more in the natural field. Yeah, so
your family and other animals, a bit like Gerald Durrell then, yeah?
Oh, yes, well, they were fantastic books.
But you studied botany and zoology at Adelaide University, didn't you? And what do you think you'd do with it when you graduated? Did you have a plan or not?
Well, there were 2 plans. One was to go to Africa to study baboons, which sounded really scary to me, so I didn't take that one up. And then the other one was to catalogue seaweeds. And I'm not sure a 21-year-old was really in the right mind space for doing that.
No, I think you made the right choice, don't you? And then you met Stephen, right? Stephen Henschke, your husband. What was he studying? Was he studying viticulture and enology?
No, he actually studied science at Adelaide Uni. So he studied subjects that would lead him into winemaking and viticulture. So he did botany and biochem. And it's in the botany, the last stages of botany, that I actually met him.
Oh, you just sat next to each other in a lecture or something?
Well, we both, my sister and I, my sister had caught up to me by then, and we were always fabulous cooks. So we always inspired. And Steve was actually a diver, so he went off and got some abalone and had the wine, of course, to go with it. And so that's how we met.
So that's the way to a woman's heart, isn't it? Abalone and a bottle of Hill of Grace. I mean, he can't fail, could he?
Well, it wasn't Hill of Grace. It was white Frontignac, do you mind?
Was it? Oh, right. I mean, you guys, you're such a great couple. You seem to work very well together. What's the secret? Do you have the same philosophy on when it comes to wine and life?
Yeah, I guess we've always followed the same interests because... I was thinking about this and I thought, well, we're very different people, but we do follow. We've more or less grown in the same atmosphere. We've done botany together. We studied together. We sort of did everything together, and there wasn't any sort of dichotomy in our relationship. So I think it just has a sort of mutual respect.
Yeah, and I think you're both fairly easygoing people. Would that be right? I mean, you seem that way to me. I don't know if you are. Yeah. And then you both went to Germany, didn't you? Yes. You went off to the Geisenheim Institute. I mean, did you speak German before you arrived?
I had done a few lessons, not much.
Did Steve?
He'd done German at school, but it still didn't get us through the Munich train station to the train on time. Never mind. By the time we actually did some language courses in Freiburg, and that brought us up to university standard to then go on to Geisenheim.
Yeah, and that was where your kind of passion for viticulture and plant physiology began, wasn't it? Or you got interested in that a bit in Adelaide?
No, it was straight into it in Germany because I guess there was an opportunity to work in the vineyards at the Vine Breeding and Grafting Institute with Helmut Becker, and he was more or less our mentor.
Lucky to have him. I mean, amazing figure in the history of wine, really.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. I mean, was the German approach very different from what you'd known back in Australia? I mean, it's a cliche to say that the Germans are more methodical and all that kind of stuff, but is that true, or was it true then?
Yes, they were more interested in the things that we're now looking at in regenerative agriculture, I guess more widely. Soil health was a really important issue for them, canopy management, new varieties. A lot of that vine breeding was going on in Germany too.
So they were way ahead of the curve, really, in terms of what the world's going through now.
I think they had to be.
Why?
Because they were looking at the economics of wine growing, and honestly, a bottle of German wine was really cheap compared to the world prices for wine. I think, it was really hard to make money. So they had to market themselves. Really, there was not a sort of extensive distribution network like we have now. And, it was hard work.
I mean, did Geisenheim make you see wine with new eyes, in a sense?
Yes, yeah. I think because it was looking at, I guess we were looking more closely at clonal selection, for one, just what those differences were. And certainly sight meant everything to a German Riesling. So that was a real eye-opener. And then their whole approach to how to look after the soil, because they were mostly on steep slopes. And around Geisenheim, around the Rüdesheim area, Rheingau area, you'd see big plastic bags of turf to replace the soil that they'd lost during the rainy season.
Because of erosion,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that tells the story in itself, I think.
I mean, you've mentioned Dr. Helmut Becker. I mean, what did you work with him on? It was sort of vine breeding, grafting. What other things did you learn with him?
He actually managed that institute. He was a vine breeder. So he did a lot of crossings. He evaluated a lot of the previous crossings that the previous managers had done. And I think he was most probably the most, I guess, the strongest voice for all those crosses, like Reichensteiner, Ehrenfelser, all those new varieties that eventually made their way to the UK.
Well, to England, I say it's his fault, right?
Yeah. And, he was looking for really beautiful characteristics. Because I think because of those crosses, Riesling or Riesling Sylvaner or whatever, they developed a more sort of aromatics in the wine. So I think that's really, he elevated that the beauty of Riesling really
to a new level. You went back to Australia. You went to Wagga Wagga. I love the name Wagga Wagga, which is Charles Sturt University. Then you got this job at Roseworth. He's a technical research assistant under Peter Dry. There were some amazing minds there at the time. I read in one Max Allen's books that you said it was the engine room of the Australian wine industry. And what kind of came out of there at that time?
Oh, certainly. Well, it was all about trying to define wine quality. And they were looking, because it was mainly viticulture, they were trying to define wine quality through fruit quality. So I guess this all came up through Richard Smart's Sunlight into Wine. So he'd done a lot of work in the US looking at different canopy styles and realised the impact of sunlight on grapes as to the colour formation, the colour and tannin formation. So we were looking at canopies, the typical Australian sprawl canopy, which was a lot of growth hanging over the grapes. They were shaded. They're also showing a high pH, high acidity syndrome. So high pH is not good for red wine. If you go over the magic point of 3.6, you start getting into ugly ferments. So the idea was to try and work out what was going wrong. And I think that there was some work done also in Oregon with Steve Price into Queston, and that was a precursor of all these colour and the colour development, the tannin development. So by exposing the bunches, the colour figures went up. They almost doubled. And we noticed that tannin maturity then came in and more flavour profile. So that was the big one, I guess. On the side, there was all the trellis research that Dick Smart did.
This is the smart Dyson trellising system.
So the variations of Scott Henry. And I guess we looked at everything. We looked at Geneva double curtain and all those sorts of things, but really Scott Henry was the one that won out. Site selection was big in those days, so looking for different areas to grow grapes, and this is where Tasmania came to the fore. What else? Oh, yeah, there was some clonal assessment on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So these two varieties have only really just come into Australia by the more legal channels.
So it's, very revolutionary times, really. I mean, all those things have been vital for the Aussie wine industry, haven't they?
Yeah, and even machine pruning, which I think we look at back at in disgust now because of the problems with Utiver. Yeah. But they were everything was sort of delving into how to improve viticulture in a big way.
I mean, you started working with Stephen in 1918. You took on your current role as viticulturist at Henschke in 87. I just wonder, what was it like, joining such a legendary winery? Was it almost scary to think, oh, God, I can't touch anything because it's been here since the mid-19th century. What can I do to change it?
Well, it was like walking into a piece of history. Yeah. And everything was done as it had been for decades. And I guess with my German experience, I thought, no, things have to change. But I had to do it gradually. So I tackled the first big one. I stopped cultivation. I thought that was the biggest problem that we had.
You stopped cultivation of what?
Of the vineyard floor. So the weed management was full cultivation. Yeah. And, it's just, I can remember it, stepping through dry sand and then thick mud after vintage. So, yeah, it was not good.
So there was no cover crop, you mean? No cover crop at all?
No. It used to be a sort of a smattering of weeds.
Yeah.
And then if they died off, all well and good. There was most probably very little mowing. And, it was, see that weed? Cultivate it. So,
and you started using compost and mulches, didn't you? I mean, really working soil health. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, that was the next step.
Yeah.
So once we had the permanent swards in place, I guess we had to look at the undervine zone, because that was another problem area. I mean, you can dodge till the cows come home, but you're still disturbing the soil. So this was also, I was stepping into the viticultural world where it wasn't really adapted to all these new ways. So I contacted a compost maker, Jeffries, to see if we could possibly buy compost off them, because we couldn't make enough of our own. And that's when we came across the green waste compost that they produced. But it was a tragic mess.
Still producing pretty good wine, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it had doll's heads and half-cut tennis balls and all sorts of rubbish in it, much like the old champagne vineyards.
Yeah, with the rubbish from Paris. Yeah.
Yes, look at it. Oh, it was a kaleidoscope of colour.
Yeah, and you switched to VSP for some of the vineyards, didn't you, for vertical shoot positioning?
Yeah.
That was a big change, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was really important. And that was the one time when Steve and I had a serious argument about the length of posts. And I guess really to do VSP a service, you've really got to have a metre of canopy and the fruiting wire at a decent height so that not everybody's crouching over to pick grapes. So I was advocating for 9-foot posts.
Yeah. I mean, Stephen's, fifth generation, isn't he? And just tell us briefly about the founder, Johann Christian Henschke. I didn't realise until I started researching him. He had a tough life, didn't he? I mean, just the voyage out there, he lost a couple of kids and his wife. And
yeah, we don't know terribly much about his actual experience, but the book that Fiona MacDonald put together for the Hill of Grace story really uses a lot of references that were written from that voyage out on the Skiod. And the whole, I think the establishment of the villages. So they actually started off in Krondorf and then moved up to Cainton later with the boys.
And he was from Silesia, was he?
Yes, yeah, from Kuchlau.
Yeah.
So, that was various. And I think that there's another book that if people really want to have a look at it, it's Hannah Kent's Devotion. And that actually goes through the life of living in a place that is sort of beginning to establish as a village.
Yeah.
And the interaction with the First Nations people. It's a fabulous
That sounds
book.
interesting. Devotion, yeah? Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to write that. Right. I mean, and yet, this guy from Silesia who'd had this tough life planted one of the world's great vineyards, right? Hill of Grace. I mean, just tell us a little bit what makes it so special. Was it him who planted it?
No, it was actually a neighbour, Nicholas Stanitsky, who actually came out on the same boat, I think. So he was a market gardener, so he had a lot of professional sort of expertise under his belt anyway. And, I often wonder, why did they select that little spot? But my bet is there was a huge red gum there that sort of indicated deep soil and a good soil moisture.
Interesting.
So, and it's actually a tiny little valley with a creek running through it.
Yeah.
And the oldest vines were planted right next to the creek. So we assume that they understood what the soil was like.
Yeah, just by observation, really, yeah?
Yeah. A deep sort of silt to red-brown lime. So that's...
It's interesting. I often ask viticulturists about this, about what makes a great vineyard great, and whether you can explain it scientifically, or a bit of it is something we can't quite explain. Is it kind of an energy, a magic? I mean, I don't want to get too kind of spooky about this, but I mean, you're a very trained scientist as well as somebody with, a strong emotional life and a hinterland. How do you see it, that vineyard?
Well, I guess it's a typical terroir site. Most probably variety played a very important role there. So Shiraz being really suited to that site, and the soil type. I think you have to select the right soil type to dry grow.
Yeah.
Something for that long.
Exactly. Well, it's very old, isn't it? I mean, how old is the vineyard? It's over 150 years old, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So it was planted just before 1860, we think.
Yeah.
We don't have a record of planting, but we do have a reference in 1860. So I guess the fascinating thing is that you could have Mataro growing on that vineyard, and it's not nearly as evocative in its presence. But it's maybe the best judge is our palate. Yeah. What we taste. And I don't think science has actually caught up with our ability to taste flavour and structure and all those things that sort of reinforce themselves on the palate.
Yeah, so. I think you're right. Just tell us briefly, I mean, because you have this kind of amazing relationship with this old vineyard. I mean, all your vineyards, obviously, you've got 110 hectares, I think, haven't you? But do old vineyards need to be farmed differently? Do they need to be pruned differently? Do they need to be, is it a bit like looking after a very old person?
Yeah, it is a bit because of the trunks being so fragile. So we'd never put a machine harvester over it. We'd never put any sort of machinery, I guess, is really a problem.
Yeah.
So undervine weeders, anything like that. So hence the permanent sward, the undervine mulching, and also the pruning technique is important. And this is where I guess the old boys really knew how to do it. And I guess it's a phrase often used when you're talking about the Simonette and search method, respect the sap flow. It's exactly what they did. And they always pruned towards the growing point or the live living part of the wood. And it was from there that you developed the head to continue the life of the vine. It was very important to always keep that live part of the vine going.
Interesting.
And that was really important. And that's really what the Simonette and search method's all about.
So it's a modern method, but they're doing something that people were doing 150 years ago in a way.
Yeah, it all stemmed from the old gobelet or basket.
Let's talk a little bit about Adelaide Hills, because you guys bought what was then an apple orchard. It was apples and pears and something else, wasn't it, in 1981 in Lenswood in the Adelaide Hills. That was pretty daring at the time, wasn't it, to do that?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, the whole valley, the whole Lenswood Valley was filled with apples and pears, and there were these three sort of vagrant winemakers up the top end. So we had Tim Knapstein, the Henschkes, and
Jeff Weaver, was he there? Yeah,
Jeff Weaver. Yeah,
Brian Crozer. He's not too far away, was he?
Well, he was at least 2 hills over.
Piccadilly, right?
Yes, but yeah, there we were, and it was quite a challenge. And I think most probably people thought the Adelaide Hills was too wet. I mean, it's over 1,000 millimetres rainfall, annual rain.
That's a lot.
Yeah. But it does come mostly when it rains double. So that's where the steepness of the slopes, the rainfall, the heaviness of the rainfall, you really had to go to permanent swards. And we had that sort of management under our belt, so we could step in.
And you'd been in Germany as well, so you had that experience. Yeah,
exactly. We knew it would work. We did have a bit of Porcet in Chardonnay, which, that really knocked us around, but we worked through that.
And just tell us about the way you farm generally, because you use organic methods. I don't know whether you use any biodynamics, but I think I'm right in saying you're not certified. I mean, I don't mean you as a person, I mean the vineyards, right? How would you describe your approach? Is it holistic? Is it regenerative? Is it sustainable? Is it just the Prue method? I don't know. What would you call it?
Well, it's actually fallen into the category of regenerative. I think that's really now that term has been coined. It most probably appropriately describes what I do. So a lot about soil health, biodiversity in the vineyard. I mean, that's bringing in my botany experience. It's all about improving the site. I'd say that it's organic, biodynamic, but also soil health as well.
Interesting. And you also have this mantra about living with the landscape. Does that mean that you have to feel as if you're part of it almost?
Yeah, well, I think the most disturbing thing for me was to see in Switzerland our product being advertised with the background of South Africa. So I thought, well, it's because we don't feature our Australian landscape, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
So I decided, well, our vineyards do look like monocultures, so it was important to start thinking about how to bring in the native vegetation. And I thought, well, I'm the only one who really is qualified to think this through. And so I put down on my list a range of spring flowering plants, and they had to be deep-throated white flowers mainly to attract beneficial insects, and came up with a few, yes. So now I think that there's a project or a program. It's not just a project, it's now a program called Eco Vineyards, which actually develops up every available space within a vineyard with the native vegetation.
Interesting.
So I think it's time.
It's an ecosystem then, isn't it, really? I mean, this is your holistic thing, I suppose. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was massal selections, because you take a lot of cuttings from older vineyards. Can you just briefly explain the process to us? And I mean, I talked to Dylan Grigg, who I know you know very well, and did a lot of work in the vineyard with you when he did his PhD at Hill of Grace. Do you believe in epigenetics as well? This sort of, I don't know, vines passing stuff on, really?
Yeah, I think I can really give a good example of this, because we did a mass selection on both Hill of Grace and Mount Edelston, and this is from my Geisenheim experience. So I knew the program, and we basically selected different stages of the vine growth, and we were looking for evenness or particular characters, maybe late bud burst, early flowering, that sort of thing. And out of this, I selected the magic vine, the super vine, in Mount Edelston. And it had beautiful maturity figures, and I thought, this is amazing. It's the perfect vine. I planted it in the mass selection, and it didn't come up
really
anywhere near the same. So we'd lost the epigenetics by taking the cuttings and regrowing. And this is what Dylan also says, that you can't replicate that epigenetic base from the old vine into the new vine.
In a new place.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was a great disappointment. Of course. But it certainly proved what Dylan's found.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the other thing I want to ask you about, you mentioned a bit at the beginning, this slightly crazy season you're living through. And I mean, a lot of the Southern Hemisphere this year has had a weird 2023 harvest. I mean, how seriously are you taking climate change? Are you noticing it every day when the vineyards you're working in?
This is really hard. We're not seeing the same impact that Europe's seeing, I think. Our season, so our vintage varies by 4 weeks anyway. We follow, because I guess Hill of Grace is always picked at the Easter moon, full moon, and that varies by 4 weeks. So we're seeing our vintage vary over that period, following that 4 week.
You always pick Hill of Grace at the full moon, the Easter full moon.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Even this year, we were thinking, no, it'll be too early. But bang, we were in the vineyard on Thursday before Easter, and then we finished Tuesday, Wednesday after Easter. And it was amazing to think that I don't know what it is, and it's hard to explain, but that is the biggest impact on our vintages at the moment. Now, that's all related to temperature as well. And I can tell you for a fact that we're going to have an early vintage next year because the Easter moon's on March the 30th. So, and we're going into El Nino. So all this covers over the impact of climate change or that creeping temperature. So we're most probably finding there must be some gradual change that we're not really noticing because the overlay of all this changeable season stuff is happening. But I think we're getting more extremes.
You think you are? Yeah.
Yeah, so more extreme frost, more extreme winds. So we had very hard flowering time. And then I guess if we have heat, we'll most probably have a more searing heat pattern.
It's this idea of climate chaos in a way, isn't it? I mean, yes, there's a pattern, but it also seems to be all over the place. You know, we're seeing that in Burgundy. I mean, yes,
well, I'd go, that's most probably a good word, climate chaos. And it sort of disrupts what everybody else is seeing as climate change.
So tell me a little bit about the work you're doing, and this ties in, I suppose, with climate change to a degree, with non-classic varieties, at least in an Australian context, things like Counoise and Barbera and Mataro, although Mataro did exist historically, and Grüne Veltliner from Austria. Which do you think of those has the most potential in your setup?
Well, I guess Grüne Veltliner is one of my favourites. I mean, I fell in love with it when we were in Germany and travelled over to Austria. It's just this beautiful, spicy, rich, almost Riesling-like, but not quite. It's more evocative. And I really enjoy that lovely spicy note in the wine. So I prefer that far in advance to Sauvignon Blanc.
Most of us do.
I really struggle with Sauvignon Blanc. But anyway, the other red varieties, I think, this is something we learned from our friends over in Europe. Perhaps using Counoise as a blender will bring up the acidity naturally. So it's got a very high acidity. Same with Barbera. Its influence on, say, Nebbiolo. So they're great sort of balances. And I think as we go into the subtle changes of climate change, maybe these varieties will be a huge help in maintaining that acid profile.
And is that something that viticulturists are talking to each other about? I mean, you know, which varieties work best in this changing climate?
And it's we were talking about it the other day because we're talking to CSIRO about their new breeding programs. What do we want? What do we want Saro to actually breed? And we're saying, well, we're looking for varieties that could act as blenders. We're perhaps not so over the moon about new varieties, but it would be nice to have something that doesn't get powdery.
I mean, powdery mildew, yeah. I mean, are there any varieties that might fall by the wayside? I mean, Merlot, for example, I mean, is that suffering with climate change?
I think Merlot, badly.
Yeah, well, wouldn't be a loss as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's really, it's sort of lost its flavour profile in preference to, say, Nebbiolo or
Cab Franc, you know.
Even Cab Franc,
Is one of the things I've always wanted to ask is there anywhere else in the world you'd like to make wine? I mean, you've done it in Germany or work in vineyards, really, obviously grow grapes.
Yeah, I think the day we went to Bandol, to Domaine Tempier, and overlooked the Mediterranean, that was the most beautiful, absolutely gorgeous vineyard site I've ever been in. And I thought, this is heaven.
That's a pretty well. I mean, the French Mediterranean is pretty lovely, isn't it? I mean, I was lucky enough to live in Avignon for a year. It's not too far away when I was a student. Man, that's so beautiful. Okay, Bandol. Yes. I'm going to hold you to that. I'd like to see you go down there, just do a bit of work in the vineyards and tell them what for, right? Listen, final question. Go on. Where else?
I'd love to be in Alsace too. I reckon Alsace.
And that's the Germanic bit of you again coming out, is it?
Yeah, but it's most probably. I mean, that whole area is beautiful. The Southern Rhine, the Baden area.
No,
but Alsace, you eat better.
Yeah, you certainly do. Some of the great food of the world in Alsace. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I want to ask you this as well, just how you get away from wine. Are you a big cook? I mean, you're a great thinker. You've got your grandkids, I know, but just tell us what you're reading. You know, what do you do when you're not in a vineyard working hard?
Oh, well, yes, I love to play golf.
Ah.
Yes. Now, I've played since I was a little thing, so that's because I lived close to a golf course when I was young, so that's why. I love working in the garden and also love cooking, yes. So the two go together.
So the botany bit of you's never left you, right? The Gerald Durrell, your family and other animals and plants.
Oh, yes. And I'm well known for looking at the ground. Anyway, and what I'm reading at the moment is actually very interesting. I'm reading through the series of the First Knowledges. So this is about the First Nations people, and it's trying to put down their history, their traditional methods, even their astronomy. That was the first book I read. It was amazing. Yeah. And I think what they can read in the sky is sort of aligning to my ideas of the influence of the cosmos, so in biodynamics. Plants, it's most probably a given. Yeah. And I've just started reading the songlines.
Ah. Now, the Bruce Chapman book.
It's sort of more the First Nations people writing about it themselves. But it's a very it's hard to get through, but it's a different way of thinking, a different way of education.
I like that. Different way of thinking, different way of education, and different way of working in vineyards, which is what you've brought really in many ways to the Australian wine industry, I'd say.
I hope so.
Yeah. Prue, listen, it's been amazing talking to you. I could talk to you for hours. It's so fascinating listening to the way you've changed this icon really and made it, I would say, even better. I mean, the most recent vintage, the 18, is just stunning. And I'll be doing my tasting notes this week to coincide with this podcast. So anyway, listen, it's been great talking to you, and I'll see you very soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Prue really is a legend, and the quality of her grapes is evident in those Henschke wines. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Pablo Alvarez from Vega Sicilia in Ribera del Duero. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @timatkin and on Instagram @timatkinmw. See you next week.